Welcome to Corporate Cafecito,
a Latine and business podcast where we share insights and strategies to help entrepreneurs and professionals thrive.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Corporate Cafecito. Yo soy Nayeli Suarez Gas.
Y yo soy Carlos Butler Vale.
So today, Carlos and I were talking about, especially as we're in mid-year review time, is do you know the metrics that are important to your company's success? And this is like, if you're an entrepreneur, you have to know how you make money. If you work in corporate, you have to understand how the company you work for makes money.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, like, we get kind of bogged down in those details. And this is where we may be the yo no sabo people.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those things where you may or may not have learned this in school. And so we certainly don't want to make assumptions that people have actually this knowledge or this information or even how to potentially leverage it.
And so some of the things, so I'll tell you, when I was in corporate, the things we most looked for were margin, volume, and profit. So I always talked about my accomplishments based on how they impacted margin, volume, and profit. So maybe we could just go through a couple that stumped us.
Yeah.
And first of all, we are not financial professionals.
We're not.
But, margin is just like how much is the difference between what it costs to make and what you're selling it at.
Yeah. And actually, before we even go there, one of the things that, as we sort of explore the topic, I think that's really important is that there seems to be a gap, particularly for Latino professionals, in terms of not necessarily getting access to this type of information unless you potentially have maybe that level of sponsorship or maybe you went through an MBA program, right? But, there are so many folks who have probably learned how to manage business from probably their own family businesses, or maybe this is the first time that they're actually in leadership roles. And so that's why this topic is also really important and significant, because we want to make sure that we're doing our part to try to close those gaps wherever they may exist.
100%. I don't necessarily think, though, that we don't have access. I think we don't know where to look for it.
And when we have it, sometimes we don't know how to speak
how to read it.
Yeah. And so, one of the things that, certainly as we continue, discussing the topic is how do you sort of speak about this and do so in a way that is relevant to the stakeholders and obviously really shines a light on the work that you do and your productivity.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I would say probably the most important metric is revenue.
Absolutely.
It's how you make money. How much money do you make?
Yeah.
And there's like regular revenue, there's revenue before, like there's net sales, and then there's revenue, and then there's profit.
Yeah.
And I think if we start just going through all these metrics, right?
Yeah.
You're like, okay, so let's say we made $1 million.
Yeah.
Okay, but it costs you $990,000 to run your company. So you made $10,000.
Yeah, exactly.
And knowing what is the expectation. I grew up in the sales industry. I love sales. And ours were always like, we always had a number to hit, right?
Yeah.
And if I hit that number, I'll know that I have done well and that I have achieved what was asked of me by the company.
Absolutely.
And then we just went through like, okay, this is what I need to do. And the first number that stumped me, I guess this is why I'm sharing the story, was P&L.
Oh,
and in my head, the first time I heard that, I thought it was P-N-L.
Yeah.
Not P and L for profits and losses.
Yeah.
And I was like, what is a P&L? And I remember, searching online, P-N-L, and getting different things that were not related to finance.
Thank goodness for Google and
I know,
Quora or whatever.
All the ones,
places.
yeah. But it's really important to understand, like, how does your company make money and how do you align the things that you do with that money making?
Yeah, absolutely. So how would you explain would be the biggest difference between the revenue and the profit?
So revenue is how much you sold.
Yeah.
Profit is how much you made.
Right, exactly. And that's what you use to pay your bills and all the other stuff that
100%.
you obviously, right?
Yeah.
And so that's where it comes in. Another, I think, really important metric that's obviously used a lot is EBITDA.
Yes.
Right? So earnings before income tax and depreciation and what's the last one? Help
Interest,
me.
tax, depreciation, and appreciation? I don't
Is it?
know. I
No,
don't
no, we got to
know.
figure this out,
Why
right?
would
I
you
know what
bring
it
that
is,
up if
but
you
yeah.
don't know what it is?
See, that's a good point.
Yeah,
But it's funny because I feel like I see it, and when I look at financial statements or I look at any
yeah.
like earnings reports, it's such a big part of it. And typically, I will say what I've noticed as a trend is that companies have gotten much better at really explaining and going through what is
Yeah.
EBITDA and what is what it
Everything else
does
is, yep.
and whatnot. But I will tell you, obviously, it's just a point of follow up. Um, this is obviously a fact that executives in particular love.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, I
when
mean, you have
you're,
to talk the talk. And if you're there and you're telling stories, but the stories aren't tied to how the company makes business or makes money,
yeah,
then it doesn't matter, right? It's like a
yeah,
nice to have. When you have any project you're working on, you have to speak about it in a way that ties it to the metrics that that your organization has prioritized.
yeah,
So, we talked about sales where it's like, here is your number, here is your budget,
yep,
here's what you have to spend, what you have to spend within, what you can't spend, how much you need to make. Sometimes we would even say, like, these are the priority items. And then we had the monthly business objectives, which are
yep,
MBOs, which came in above your annual goals. And so you just had to be like, boom, 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 boom.
yeah,
Okay, I got it. And so whenever I would send out an email, I would always talk about that. I would say, on the path to get to a 10% growth, these are the things I'm working on. Here are my barriers. Here's where I need help and support. And here are my concerns. And by the way, I'm going to call and say I'm not going to hit that number.
And that was a formula that you came up with on your own, or was that something that the company had
No, that was
shared
something I
as like
came up on my own.
this is a framework that we like to provide? Because I know I've seen
Yeah,
actually both where companies are very specific about how they want people to report out
right.
on their work, and then also some folks, to your point, like they can kind of
No, I
create
made
their
my
own.
own because I wanted it to be aligned to just my number, my goals, etc.
Yeah,
And I always sent it out before we had our meetings on Monday so that by the time we got to the meeting, my boss would be like, I already know what's going on with you.
that's awesome.
And I did not like being in the hot seat.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
didn't want to. You were proactive as
Yep.
obviously as
Mhm.
obvious as much as you could.
Mm.
For me,
I was
oh,
going
go
to say,
ahead.
yeah, you worked in HR. You probably had completely different
I was
metrics.
just going to say,
Yeah.
for me, I mean, I think some of the biggest and most important metrics were headcount, retention. Those things are very important because obviously your people are your biggest, typically, financial
Yeah.
investment, other than maybe capital expenditures. And we talked about this before, but the saying of, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? The reality is that you can have the best strategy in the world, you can have the best ideas in the world, but if you don't have your people there, you don't have the right headcount,
Right.
or maybe you're over on headcount, maybe you are doing, retention in particular was really important because typically it costs significantly more money to actually bring someone
It
new into the
does. And
organization.
every time someone leaves, they take away all their experience, their
All that
knowledge.
IP,
Everything's
right?
just
Yeah,
gone.
all that
Yeah.
intellectual property is gone. And in I would say conservative estimates say that typically it takes about 8 to 9 months for the new person coming in to actually be able to perform at the level that the last person was working in. And
I
so
always call that the 6 months of stupid.
the
Where you're just going through those first 6 months of like, what am I doing? Why am I here? I can't do any
I
of
thought you were
this.
talking about that on the other end of it, where it's
No,
like
no,
you're the
no.
boss and you're like, okay, I guess I'm just expecting you not to be able
No,
to,
when you bring someone on and you're
yeah,
like, you have to allow that person to go through
absolutely.
those stupid moments. But to your point, when a person leaves and you hire a new one, as competent as that new one is, that last one takes all that knowledge. So you have to start over.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and the reality is, again, you're typically paying someone from the outside more money than you would necessarily by having that person retain or maybe even necessarily promoting that
Right.
individual. So obviously something that's really important. And, maybe not so explicit in kind of the P&L, but certainly that goes more in sort of the loss, typically cost center, sort of realm. And then my favorite,
Mhm.
which is not necessarily tied to HR, but but can also be tied to HR people practices is ROI. So how do you what do you feel about ROI?
ROI means return on investment. And I love ROI. I use ROI with my kids.
Oh, I love that. That's awesome.
Because I'm like, okay, so my younger son, Mario, if you give him $20, he will go to the store and spend $20.
Okay.
And then I'm like, you're already over that toy or you're already over that whatever. And so I'm like, what was your return on it? And, I also tell them not to have a meeting without an agenda.
Okay.
But
as
but
a
to
parent,
me,
you're saying? Okay, cool.
But as an ROI is if I put in $10, what am I getting back?
Yeah.
And my dad would always say, no perder y es ganancia, which is great. If your ROI is just to keep that money safe, great. Then 0% is the goal.
Yeah.
If
Como
you
dicen en
need,
inglés, a penny earned is a penny saved.
oh, I
A
didn't
penny
know.
saved is a penny earned.
Oh,
yes,
I'm like,
there we go.
I don't know
See?
cómo se dice en
Yeah,
inglés.
but it's kind of like, if you don't spend it, you're basically, es tu ganancia, no?
Yeah.
Okay.
But ROI is if I am giving it this much attention, or if I am giving this much money, or if I'm putting in this much time, what is the return?
Yes.
So, I'll give you an example with our podcast, right? This is an act of love.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the ROI is emotional.
Absolutely.
It is through like the people we connect with, the people whose stories we get to amplify.
Absolutely.
Like that is the ROI.
Yeah.
When I do business, right, there's going to be times where, what is it? Is that when someone tells me a price and I think it's too high, I'm like, is that the I don't want to do it price? Because there is the I don't want to do it price. To not get that business. So that makes me, laugh. Sometimes I think about that and I'm like, there's things I don't like to do. So I give out the I don't want to do this price, but I'll do it at that price because at that point the ROI is worth it for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So ROI is just your return on investment.
Yeah, and I think why I love ROI so much is because return on investment so much is because it's both for the business and for you. So like to your point, even if as a corporate employee, I think about the ROI for me as an individual, right? Like, is this something that I know that I can put the time, the energy, the effort into, and that I'm going to be able to give my best, right? Or that ultimately it's going to help me, to your point, achieve those goals, right? Because sometimes you have to negotiate. There have been times where I've had to say, listen, I appreciate that this is the direction that we want to go in, but quite frankly, the ROI isn't high enough to pursue this. And so we should probably maybe, and then that I take that opportunity to provide maybe an alternative, right, solution to it. It's not just simply, let's not do this. But it can apply to work. It can apply to personal. It can apply, like you said, with your kiddos. And so it is something, especially I think as folks grapple with burnout and things like a desire to achieve more work-life balance and making sure that the projects that you're working on are significant, that ROI calculation is absolutely key.
Oh yeah, 100%. And I do want to just build and say like ROI should also be how you think about things in networking.
Oh, yeah.
Am I putting my time towards an organization where I feel I'm going to have a return on investment?
Absolutely.
Why am I going to sign up for, this golf outing? Well, maybe because if I go to that golf outing, I'm going to meet these 3 people. And that will make it worth it to me to spend the $100 or whatever a golf outing costs. So I think when we think about ROI, it's not just like financial, but it's like, what is my metric for knowing that this networking event was a success? What is my ROI for this gala I go to, or for so I just think that oftentimes like return on investment should just be in your head of like, I am investing my time, or I am investing in a kid's future, right? If it's like prepping them for college, like, what is my ROI if I put my kid through the ACT prep or the SAT prep, right? If it's going to improve his score by 3 points, and are those 3 points then going to give him more scholarships? Like, you have to think about ROI with everything.
Can we just stick really quickly to that example for about a golf outing, right? the way that I sort of see to ROI, to your point, on a personal basis is what am I giving up? And so if that means time with my family, if that means,
I believe
you
what you're
know,
talking about is opportunity cost.
yeah, absolutely, right? So what is the opportunity cost?
Hmm.
And is the potential return, because let's talk about this, right? Just simply being there and meeting three people isn't enough. Are you there with a purpose? Are you there with a plan,
Yeah,
right? And are you going to do the follow-up necessary to ensure that you are going to overcome that opportunity cost.
right.
And that opportunity cost could be I'm giving up half of a Saturday, and this is my one day of the week where I actually have an opportunity to relax. Or maybe it's the one way of the week where I have an opportunity to spend with my kids. And so that, I think, it just
Yep.
drives home the point, whether, again, you're doing this for personal reasons or for business reasons or both, you want to make sure you really think about that.
Yeah,
But
because
yeah.
so opportunity cost is what you're giving up
Mm-hmm.
to go do something. So, for example, let's say, as an entrepreneur, my opportunity cost to launch my own business was giving up my salary, but not just my salary. It also included giving up my health insurance, my 401k, getting rid of my stability of the every other week paycheck. It was like, the prestige of maybe belonging to a bigger organization, it was not going to some of the trade shows or not being
Yeah.
the featured
Yeah.
speaker at certain events. And so when you weigh the opportunity cost, it's everything that you give up to do the other thing.
I love that. Thank you for expanding on that, because I think that's really important. Because again, there's business opportunity costs, and then there's like individual opportunity costs. And
Right.
I think um, the more we hear about burnout and just the need for additional work-life balance, and one of the things that I read recently was employees feeling underutilized or feeling like they're working on projects that aren't necessarily don't bring them passion. That to me is an opportunity cost, right?
Oh, you
Potentially.
know what I also think? I
Yeah.
think that's an opportunity to understand the metrics and the purpose of why we're doing that project. Because
Yeah.
if you're getting burned out, or if you're not, if you're kind of just like ho humming through a project, you may not know the purpose of the project.
Right.
You may
Absolutely.
not understand why that project is valuable or what it's bringing to the company,
Yeah.
which means you're not seeing how the the project is bringing value, and you're not
Yeah.
understanding how they're measuring the value of your project.
And what you can do in that case is take some moment to maybe even redefine potentially,
Yeah.
right? And that's what kind of that negotiation happens, which is, hey, I know this is important. And by the way, for me to feel really good about this, like I'd like to do X or I'd like to do Y. That gives you some of that, that piece.
If you
Wonderful.
can. I mean, because other times, like
You
when we had
can.
our
Yeah, you're
when
right.
we had our monthly business objectives, it was like, you're gonna sell this month and it needs to be on the shelf. And we were like, okay, like no matter what happens, this is our priority
Yeah.
and whatnot. So I think it's also understanding, like, we had to understand why we were doing it, what was the metric, and is there wiggle room? Because a lot of times there may not be wiggle room. Like, you may have to be on that project, but if you understand why you're doing that project or the value it's bringing the organization, it might
Yeah.
change how you approach it.
Absolutely. So let's talk about why this matters to our listeners
Mhm.
in their role, right? So, one of the things that we've talked about is obviously the important, I would say, incredible importance of tying the work that you do to metrics that matter,
Yes.
not just necessarily to you, but to the business. And
Mhm.
so, one example that I like to give is that working in HR, there were always HR related metrics. And yeah, they were great, they were important. And I would love to talk about headcount and I would love to talk about retention because that ultimately played a role in the P&L.
Mhm.
But if I'm talking to the CMO, I'm also going to talk about how the work that we're doing is helping potentially with things like the cost of acquisition,
Yes.
right?
Mhm.
Or, how it's bringing money back into the marketing budget so that we could reuse
Right.
some of those dollars, right? Or if
Elevating our talent and what's that worth, and
yes,
yeah.
absolutely. And so, if I can encourage our listeners to do anything, is to really think about those top three, maybe
Mhm.
stakeholders that they work with and say, okay, for my boss, it's important for me to make sure that I'm working on these metrics, but for the stakeholders that I'm working with, have those conversations. Hey, what's your top 2 or 3 metrics? I can't help you necessarily with all of them, but if I can do my work in HR to help you reduce your costs of customer acquisition and then bring that back to them, I think is really important. So first bullet is making sure that you're tying the work that you're doing to metrics and that you're giving it visibility, which I know we've talked about before, and obviously we've got other topics that we can discuss on that.
No, yeah, no, I 100% agree. You have to know what everybody is getting incentivized on, what their annual goals are, because, Carlos, I think you said it really well. It's like, I need to hit this number, but that person needs to make sure this is handled and this person needs that. And so it was really interesting. I had this position and I had to make sure things sold, but someone else had to make sure we had enough corn.
Yeah.
And so, and someone else had to make sure that we had the right foil to like package things in. And
That's
so,
such a good example.
Yeah, because it was like we're all going to make the same product, but we're all looking at it from a very different spot.
Yeah.
And
that leaders, by the way, is looking at it all in
100%
in regards to ROI.
They're
and
just
P&L,
that's
right?
it. They're just looking at the dollar sign.
Yeah.
And so, it was very interesting. I was at a meeting the other day, and the procurement team walked in, and I go, "Oh, thank God you're here. You're the people with the money," because and they were like, "Oh yeah," and I'm like, "You're so critical, because you will decide what we do."
Yeah.
And so I think that if you just give each, like, understand the team, understand the metrics. If you don't know the metrics or you need more explanation, like, go to YouTube University.
Absolutely.
That's what Reina calls it.
Yeah.
And, it'll walk you through how to do each one. There's so many. Even if you go online and you're like, I need a calculator for this, there's so many. I have one called Easy Calculator on my phone that will tell me like how to make a car payment, what does sending an extra $20 to my mortgage do a month.
That's awesome.
And so there's so many tools out there that it would be super easy if you were just like, I need to calculate a profit and loss statement. How do I do that? And there's already like Excel files generated, and also just search in like an Excel or Google Sheets or whatever, because they'll also tell you, like, if you're like, I'm trying to find this, they'll be like, this is how you do it.
Yeah, like if you're using Copilot or, nowadays, not to give props to anyone particular, but I like using ChatGPT. There's obviously a lot of different models out there, but, I could even research before I go into a conversation with like a CMO and I say, hey, what are typically the top 3 maybe metrics that are important? I keep saying CMO. It's just obviously for illustrative purposes, but whatever individual it is that you're working with, like there's a lot that you can do in advance, but making sure you're doing that. I think, as we're talking about kind of mid-year, maybe depending on where you are in your fiscal year, another reason why this matters is particularly I've seen it around promotion conversations, because one of the things that I think becomes more and more prevalent is this idea that everybody's here to work hard. So, great. You're going to get a 3, maybe a 4 out of 5 if you're working
really
hard, right?
Yeah.
But if you are but it's the use of this type of data. It's going back to these types of points that I think makes the biggest difference.
I agree.
When it comes to those promotion conversations. And that doesn't mean that it's always going to result in a promotion, but it certainly means that at any rate, whether you choose to stay at that company or you choose to leave or whatever that might be, doing that homework is going to absolutely prepare you for whatever might come next.
So I'm going to piggyback off that because I think that's such a good point. When you are interviewing, if you are going to join a new company, here's some things that you can do. One, download, if it's a publicly traded company, there's an annual report. In the annual report, it's going to tell you how they make money. It's going to walk you through like what they've done, what countries, how all that money feeds into the US, what their total numbers were, what their values are, what they believe, where they're investing, where they're not investing. It'll give you like their entire financial statement so that you can learn how they talk and what they value so that when you go into an interview, you're prepared.
Yeah.
oftentimes these same CEOs will give out quarterly conversations. I don't know what they're called, but like they'll do a quarterly meeting for the shareholders or maybe annual or biannual.
Yeah, I've seen mostly like annual or biannual, but yeah.
But you can hop on. You could also find the recordings and you could go back and see like where they were trending last year. If you build some of your interview questions around these, that'll also show that you're like really researching how they make money and what they're looking for. So it really highlights like your financial prowess.
I agree. And I think, oftentimes we sort of ask ourselves like, where are, to your point, like where are the places, how do I start kind of doing this work? And I think, there's kind of some main questions that are really important to kind of ask. One is like, what business problem am I solving for? That's, I think, a really great start, because the reality is it's not necessarily what problem am I solving for, but it's specifically tied to the business, right? And then I think another thing that I have found that has been really helpful is like when we're talking about opportunity cost, it's like, what would happen if I stopped doing this?
Oh yeah, 100%.
Right?
I had a boss, and we had the rule of 3 with him, and it was like he had to ask us 3 times. Because if he asked us the first time, we're like, he's just brainstorming. If he asked again, we're like, ooh, he might be considering it. By the 3rd time he asked, then we would do the work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another thing, and you and I have talked about this, and this is probably a good opportunity for us, but maybe have a corporate Cafecito journal where you are also tracking the impact, even the soft skills that 100%. You are learning, but specifically through outcomes.
Yes.
And again, that's just part of that homework that you're doing in terms of self-development that gives you an opportunity to say, you know what? I forgot what the A in EBITDA stands for, so it's time for me to go back and do a little bit
of refresher.
Refresher. And one thing that I've learned is that it's okay to ask for permission to sit in on things like finance or strategy meetings. Again, we talked about this, but asking leaders what KPIs matter most. And you talked about this, Google's free.
Yeah, Google's free. Yeah. YouTube's free. Exactly. Everybody's already done it. You could even do some of those master classes, which is not free, but I think that I don't know how much they do cost. Yeah. But the point is
that's
like
the opportunity cost.
Yeah.
Right? Go through that. Yeah, go through that and figure out.
I'm a big believer, and you've probably heard me say this a million times because it is my mantra. Like, it is okay to feel stupid. It is not okay to stay stupid.
Oh, I love
and
that.
So if you feel a certain way or there's something you don't understand, research it until you do get it, and get it to the point that you can explain it so that you can just so like that you feel confident, because when we are confident, we shine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to that point, right, as we wrap up, like as we get into our final sip, speaking of, let me grab my final sip.
Yeah.
We talked about this, but when you can tie your work to money, you earn a seat at the table.
You become valuable.
Yeah, you become valuable. And I think particularly for our Latine folks that are actually, that are listeners, one of the things that is really important to remember is that tu cultura plus the competency that you're building equals power.
Yes, it does.
It really does. And I would say the last thing to remind folks is that you don't need an MBA necessarily. If you have one, that's great, to talk business. Some of the folks that I've actually talked business with, like really great conversations, were people who actually dropped out of college and decided to start their own businesses.
Well, I think, education doesn't equal like understanding and financial literacy.
Right, exactly.
So it's also important, like, I think that if you do have a degree or an MBA, like, that's amazing.
Absolutely.
And, it does show a discipline, and it shows an understanding, but it's not limited to what you learn there. Like my finance classes in undergrad and in my master's program, I barely made it through. I hated finance. I didn't learn it till I was on the job.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. And to that end, like, if you don't have that, and actually for whatever it is, whether you have it or not, the most important thing is to have a little bit of curiosity.
Agreed.
Because if you go through these steps, if you go through this process, you will inevitably learn something. And to your point, knowledge isn't necessarily everything. So how are you then taking that knowledge that you're learning and applying it so that you are elevating and then amplifying all of that work.
Agreed.
Awesome.
Perfect. Well,
look at that.
I know. Time goes by so
Obviously,
fast when we're
it's a topic
drinking
that we love,
cafecito.
so yeah.
All right, well, we'll wait for you here la próxima vez con otro cafecito.
Con otro cafecito.
Yeah.
I know.
Bye.
See you.